Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green, joined by a friend and accomplished scholar and policy entrepreneur, Mira Rapp-Hooper. Dr. Hooper, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's great to be back with you.
So Mira just finished an impressive tour on the NSC staff in the White House as Senior Director and Special Assistant to the President with responsibility for East Asia, Oceania, but really building alliances and partnerships as part of the overall Asia strategy, which we're going to go into. And you've been on, Mira, early in this podcast as a rising star. You're now a risen star, but just to tell the origin story once again, you got a PhD, went into the think tank and then policy world. At what point did you figure out that was the path you wanted to get on?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. It's one that you had something to do with. And of course, we'll come to that in just a moment. But again, thanks so much for having me back. My interest in national security started when I was very young in high school. And I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but I was actually a senior in high school, now dating myself extremely, on September 11th and was just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center. So experienced firsthand the horrors of that day and knew that I wanted to play some small role in trying to avert catastrophes like that in my own country going forward. But for me, I remained interested in national security issues throughout college. But when I looked towards my grad school choices, I looked at careers that I thought I would most want to emulate. And I was able to identify at least 3 people who I thought were occupying spaces that would just be fascinating to be able to emulate. And that included you, Mike. It included Victor Cha, and it also included Kurt Campbell. And all 3 of you, I'm fortunate to say, have gone on to become mentors of mine, and I've been super lucky to work with you. I got my PhD at Columbia University, and I entered the PhD program knowing there was a decent chance I would never go into academia, but very much wanting to be someone who could write, research, potentially write multiple books over the course of her career, and really be able to do the deep, rigorous type of thinking that I would learn how to do in a PhD program. And interestingly, I entered grad school as a budding nuclear weapons expert, decided to write a dissertation on extended deterrence, and left grad school increasingly as an Asia expert because my dissertation made me fall in love with Japan and South Korea. That's where I had the great pleasure of meeting Mike Green, who offered me my first job out of Columbia, working with him at CSIS as the first director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. And the rest is kind of history. I spent the next several years working in think tanks, wrote a couple of books, and then finally did have the opportunity to go into government with the Biden administration.
AMTI, the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, was an idea John Hamre had that then I kind of got funding for and planted a little bit, thinking it would grow into a kind of a small sapling. You created a forest of analysis around maritime challenges to the status quo using overhead imagery. It was a very high-impact project at CSIS and really effective because it just told what was happening. It was letting people draw their own conclusions based on overhead imagery. And in some ways, a kind of metaphor for the competition we're in right now. You need allies, partners to draw their own conclusions, to be given the facts. So maybe it was a good training for you because you then went on to the NSC. I know you were very involved in the Biden administration with Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell writing the Indo-Pacific strategy, which came out what seems like a decade ago, but and what was it, within the first year or so of the administration. It was an unequivocal statement that American strategy would be centered on allies and partners after, as you know, a decade of debate about whether we were moving towards reassurance and G2 with China or multipolarity and all these big conceptual debates. And that document really said, no, we're all about allies and partners. Tell me a little, was there much debate about that, or did everyone come in with those assumptions? Did you have to convince your bosses or the big boss, President Biden? What was it like getting the assumptions into that strategy? Because that often is the hardest part.
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike, and I'll dive into it in just one moment. I want to actually start by saying what I think the task was when we came into office, because the Indo-Pacific strategy really flows from the geostrategic task. When we took office in 2021, the president assumed office, we were looking at a region in which it increasingly seemed like China was ineluctably on the march. The United States had really been crippled by COVID. We saw this several-year period of Chinese economic coercion, wolf warrior diplomacy. America's alliances were not in great shape. And it really felt like if you looked across the region, this could be the moment where China just ran away with the ball. And so we set our sights on nothing short of trying to restore the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific to the United States and its allies and partners. And we don't say that quite so explicitly in the Indo-Pacific strategy, but that was the objective that we had in mind. And the modus operandi that we lay out to do that, to undertake that fact, is the idea of building collective capacity alongside our friends throughout the region. And for our money, there really was no way to shift that balance back in our favor undeniably unless we did so with our allies and partners. And pretty remarkably, there was no debate within the interagency as to whether or not that was the right way to frame this strategy, especially for the sake of a public document. Now, there are, as you know, Mike, are always challenges when you write a government strategy. Everybody kind of wants to get their pet rock in there. You really have to fight to make sure that the thing does not become a Christmas tree. But there was almost universal agreement, number one, that this is a strategy about allies and partners. And number two, that if it was to succeed, its framing was going to have to be positive and affirmative. That rather than making this about competing with and beating the PRC, what we would have to do is lay out a positive vision of what we stood for and sought to achieve in the Indo-Pacific, so that it wasn't just Australia and Japan and the ROK, but increasingly Vietnam and Indonesia that also could see pieces of themselves in that strategy and would then have a desire to buy into it.
It wasn't completely out of whole cloth, though. I mean, there were some elements of alliance policy that came out of the Trump administration that were useful, weren't there? India, Modi, not unhappy with the Trump administration. Abe, the joke in the Japanese foreign ministry was Prime Minister Abe didn't have 20 summits with President Trump. He had the same summit 20 times. There was a lot of defense and whack-a-mole and dealing with some bad ideas coming out of the White House. But the Japanese view was that in the Trump administration, they made a lot of progress. Quad elevated to a foreign minister summit, and the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which Abe had introduced and convinced the Trump team to use, you guys took. So there must have been some areas where you saw continuity, right?
Totally. And for our money, if we were going to build a strategy that was to last, there's a strong interest in making it bipartisan. So there's a very intentional decision to take to the leader level a grouping that had already existed at the foreign ministerial level under the prior Trump administration and make the leader level Quad a Biden initiative, but also acknowledge that this had started under Trump. We were not interested in building structures that were just going to be a flash in the pan or be attributed to one administration. This really was a long-term strategy that was intended to be handed off so that a president of any party could carry it forward, albeit with his or her own branding and nuances. But it was absolutely intentional, not only to reflect progress that had been made in certain relationships, but to, as I said before, try to reflect what each of these players saw in themselves in the strategy. If you look at our goals for what we said we hope to see in the U.S.-India relationship, it was that India is increasingly a regional power that is also increasingly aligned with the United States. And so the intent was to reflect India's goals for itself in our own strategy so that each ally or partner would point to the document and say, like, hey, that's me. Let's do this thing.
So if your strategy as it was designed to create a more favorable balance of power in a increasingly multipolar Asia where India, Japan, Australia have sovereign capabilities, are resilient, can resist coercion, it's a much easier sell, isn't it? Yeah, it's not imperialistic or hegemonistic when you're saying allies and partners, we want you to have the sovereign capabilities and resilience to maintain this balance of power that, frankly, the U.S. can't do alone anymore. That was implicit in the strategy, recognition that the Pax Americana was changing. Is that a fair summary?
That is absolutely fair. You were one of our sage advisors, Mike, early in the game who got an early look at the strategy. And that was absolutely baked into the cake, the fact that we could not do this alone. And when it came to the question of getting that allied and partner buy-in, we tried to walk the walk on this piece too. I'm not sure if other administrations have done this, but I do know that well in advance of releasing our strategy, we briefed it in detail to a wide range of allied and partner countries, and we took their feedback. And with almost every ally or partner, we took some feedback that they gave us on the strategy and actually made a change to reflect their view. And then we implemented inside the US government that document that our allies and partners had actually had the chance to edit. So the idea was, if you see this thing from the beginning, if you feel like it's rowing in the right direction from the beginning, then as we all move out together, you're going to be even more invested.
So as we discussed at the time, and as you undoubtedly expected, not every ally and partner was going to be happy. What kind of scratches the itch for Tokyo might not work for Seoul, let alone Singapore, and so on and so forth. One of the things that I think was challenging and that I heard about in the region was the how does this all end bit. So we, the allies and partners were doing more individually and collectively, and the U.S. is transferring technology and capability, distributing force posture to maintain that favorable balance of power. But how does this all end? And the administration was never quite able, in my view, to articulate that, maybe because there wasn't consensus. I used to joke that our friend Tom Wright, who wrote the National Security Strategy, the best he could get was to say something like, mutual coexistence is not necessarily impossible, or some sort of, Star Trek Spock phrase to try to capture the end game for strategic competition. I think for some allies, that was a little uncomfortable because they were saying, look, we want to bend China back to a more cooperative, productive relationship, even if it happens after Xi, even if it takes a decade or two or three. I sense on that one, there may not have been a consensus in the administration, because there isn't in the U.S., about how this all ends. But what can you tell us?
So I think there's a lot of overlap or even consensus in our collective thinking on this question. But of course, if you're projecting out 10 years or more, there's a lot of danger in making a concrete prediction, and especially a concrete prediction that's going to outlast necessarily any Biden administration, right? So not a lot of incentive to put the sort of clear end state on paper because of how dynamic the region is. But I would say some version of the two sentences that you just uttered, Mike, which is essentially to shore up and reinforce a free and open Indo-Pacific until China becomes more of a participant in the existing order and less inclined to try to change the status quo. And there were no illusions that that was going to happen quickly. And indeed, a lot of our documents and China strategy in particular use a phrase like decisive decade to indicate that our administration really did understand, President Biden really understood, that the next 10 years under Xi Jinping were likely to be of the highest consequence and potentially the most tenuous. And only thereafter would we necessarily expect to see that leveling off, where the free and open region that we are all working towards would really have the chance to prevail.
To be fair, Kennan never really said how the Cold War would end in all of his seminal strategic documents, but that proved untenable. And, eventually the Reagan administration moved to roll back, and, Reagan said how it ends: we win, they lose. So I suspect these debates are going to continue in the U.S., and it's going to be a bit uncomfortable for our allies because we'll have them out loud. The other one that I know was hard for you, and I know you and Kurt and others got in trouble a lot over this one, is trade. So, IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, got into the document. There was some effort. It was halting because there was no consensus on what that was for. The inherited wisdom, and certainly what I grew up believing, is that a trade policy is an absolutely essential component of any strategy towards Asia. I know that's what animated your thinking and Kurt's thinking. It was really hard. Any reflections? Maybe was that wrong? Because it's going to be awfully hard to get TPP, CPTPP, IPEF moving again. Should we be thinking about the economic pillar differently? If you still have PTSD from that, you can pass, but what's your takeaway?
My takeaway is that had we had more time, or had the vice president been elected, there definitely was a follow-on economic agenda to be had in the Indo-Pacific that was in very high demand. I think we saw that there were certain parts of IPEF that were taken up very well received, like the supply chain pillar, others less so. But as you say, Mike, we never stopped hearing the call from the region to do more in the economic space in ways that really tied us into the region. Now, we can get into a debate, and I honestly don't know the answer about what is the world in which it might be possible to renegotiate parts of TPP or maybe do something more modest like a digital trade agreement. But I also think that as we think about the toolkit we have going forward, there are entire ecosystems of economic investment and entanglement that we have not fully exploited in the Indo-Pacific that any administration should be thinking long and hard about. For example, through the CHIPS Act, we started to be able to make investments in some of our Indo-Pacific friends' semiconductor ecosystems. And top of the heap for us was Vietnam, where that was a critical part of our comprehensive strategic partnership that President Biden struck with the prior general secretary in Hanoi. And the offer of that investment in Vietnam's semiconductor ecosystem was actually really what got that partnership over the line, because it demonstrated that the United States was seeing in Vietnam a type of development that Vietnam saw in itself. So with more time, I would, I know others would, Kurt certainly would, advocate for the building of a tech ecosystem across ASEAN, where things like chip supply chains, workforce incubators, AI hubs, data centers are basically unfurled across Southeast Asia as part of this friendshoring process that we know we need to accelerate because of the challenges posed by the PRC in the tech sector. Now, that's not the only way we could have done more in this space, but it is an example of the fact that even if we are still in a world where trade agreements are very hard, we can still answer the demand to do more in the economic space.
I think that's right. I think other areas would be critical minerals, LNG, and AI rules, and creating the public-private partnerships, the financing arrangements, the national security context. I think the Japanese are furthest along in thinking about this among our allies, but everyone is. And the old Bretton Woods trade liberalization, framework is just too hard to sell. And frankly, it's reaching diminishing returns, really. There's not that much to liberalize. You're still, as of a week or two ago, had the most liberalized economy in the world. It's a big, huge topic. Students and, younger officials watching this to tackle over the course of their career, because economic statecraft is critical, but we're playing a different game and we don't know what the rules are or what the goalposts look like. The other one you guys got really tripped up on, and I had long debates with Kurt about it, was democracy. So the president was really committed in an admirable way to making democracy a centerpiece of his administration. It came out of his own experience with Charlottesville and things in the U.S. and his, frankly, old school democratic view about democracy in the world. It didn't quite work. The Summit for Democracy, it's very hard to have an inclusive strategy for allies and partners on the one hand, and on the other hand, have a huge summit where we say who really gets to sit at the cool table with the real democracies. All the more awkward when ours had certain blemishes the world could see. So there were real divisions. I could see it quite clearly between the Asia hands and the democracy hands. My view, and I've written this a lot with friends of yours like Derek Mitchell and Dan Twining, is that the two should go hand in hand. But you were in the middle of that. What's your kind of reflection on how we should think about our values? Not a hot topic right now with the current administration, but a long-term American priority. How should we be thinking about the role of democratic governance and our values in our foreign policy strategy?
I think it is possible to do this, in line with what you just said, Mike, basically in line, values going hand in hand with the balance of power agenda that I just laid out, but to do it in a way that is respectful of countries who, frankly, we critically need on our team and who may have a longer path to walk until they sort of reach the democratic standards that you or I might measure a consolidated democracy by. And part of the reason why I think you're pointing to a debate is because part of the challenge really does lie in the Indo-Pacific, where some of the partners we absolutely critically need on our side may not either be democracies in a definitional sort of political science sense, right? Or may not be democracies at all. And that does not kind of undercut the need or does not negate the need to be able to have strong partnerships with countries with differing political systems. So one thing that I think we did do successfully is identify kind of within the democracy bucket certain types of agendas that could be pursued with non-democracies that allowed for productive cooperative relationships and helped to eke them in a more democratic direction, even as we were not trying to transform their system. So there I'm thinking about work on anti-corruption, which was an essential part of Biden administration policy and I think was well received by a number of our partners, including those who were not democracies. But as you say, there is some inherent tension on this issue, particularly when working inside Asia. And I think we can both be pragmatic and say, it is our job as the United States of America trying to lead a coalition of friends who will keep the Indo-Pacific free and open to make that coalition diverse and pluralistic and as strong as it can be, while still walking the walk on our own values and doing so in a subtle enough way that the countries we need to keep on our side are able to do that work with us.
My recommendation, you'll recall, was if the strategy is about empowering allies and partners, why not have Indonesia or Korea lead on this effort in the region? Eventually they did. And the first summit was done in Washington and the White House controlled it. And as always happens when the White House wants to control things, it was a little too controlling. But yes, eventually the Koreans picked it up. Yoon embraced it. This is a constant debate and tension, but inevitably, even Henry Kissinger, in his last speech as a Secretary of State, wrote speeches on how values are important for foreign policy because he realized his hyperrealism was losing the American public. So we're constantly adjusting. My view is the U.S. is the only country really that has the heft, has the size, and sort of the sort of founding principles to keep at this. And then others can criticize us for not being subtle, and then we should listen and adjust. Right now, we're not in a democracy mode in our international profile, but I am certain it will come back.
But also note, just before we leave this topic, that during our time in office, we did see some important developments, which would not amount to sort of changes in systems wholesale, but in particular, a lot of advancement of LGBTQ agendas in the Indo-Pacific and a significant expansion of disability rights and protections in several countries. And one of the things I think our team did really well was not just have an Asia policy, but have an Asia policy that was very rigorously implemented, probably much to the chagrin of all of our departments and agencies, but such that our work overlapped with all of our special representatives. So I would meet often with Sarah Minkara, who was our special representative for disability rights. And we would talk about how she was going to sort of get disability higher and higher on the ASEAN agenda. And the wins were not always historic on these issues. But as you know very well, Rahm Emanuel played a role in advocating for LGBTQ rights and protections in Japan with really great success. So I do think in having these more focused agendas, even in areas that are really challenging, we can prevail.
The other thing that happened was over the course of the last few years, Japan and Korea really stepped up in this area, in the civil society world and in foreign policy. Democratic values features prominently now in Japanese government and strategic documents. It did under Yoon in Korea. We'll see where things go. Anyway, this is a never-ending but incredibly important piece of the story. When you do these strategies, or when you are in a transition team, and we both had this experience, you come in and then you get some unpleasant surprises and some pleasant surprises. In the Bush administration, the pleasant surprise was Koizumi. Got elected a few months after President Bush, a real, maybe not the level of Abe, but a real hard-charging Japanese leader. The bad luck was Korea, no Hyun. We navigated that pretty well. The Obama administration had sort of the opposite. They got Lee Myung-bak, but then Hatayama in Japan. Now that you got a government, you can name and shame. But what were the pleasant surprises? What were the challenges that you had to deal with in terms of leaders and governments among these allies and partners you were trying to knit together?
So at least two super pleasant surprises stand out. The first one, no stranger to you, was Kishida Fumio. Obviously, we had gotten along great with his successor, Prime Minister Suga. We knew him from his time as foreign minister. But what I don't think anyone could have had on their bingo card was the extent to which Prime Minister Kishida was going to oversee a national security revolution in Japan and take positions that were so strong and unflinching as to position himself as just the most exquisite ally on pretty much every single issue that was on the table. One of the first meetings that he and President Biden had was a video conference call in which President Biden briefed Prime Minister Kishida, on the fact that Vladimir Putin was about to invade Ukraine. And Mike, as you will know very well, at that time, we did not know where Kishida was going to come out in terms of whether he would speak publicly against Russian actions, join a sanctions coalition, because Japan had especially Japanese conservatives, had a longstanding goal of resolving a territorial sovereignty issue with Russia. And that had been something that was really significant for Prime Minister Abe. But Prime Minister Kishida did not flinch in breaking with tradition and standing on the right side of history and really leading the right side of history within the Indo-Pacific to show that what was happening in Europe mattered to Asia too. And he was willing to go to the mat on Ukraine about a zillion times over. So part of the reason, frankly, our strategy of trying to knit together allies and partners was so successful in many of our views is because we had partners like Prime Minister Kishida who stepped up bigger and better than we could have anticipated. Of a different cloth, but a similar directional positive surprise, Ferdinand Marcos, who was just is still a fantastic partner in the Philippines, desired nothing more than to modernize our alliance and really bring it into alignment with our other treaty alliances in the region, willing to work in the most granular of ways to, whether it's to shore up our alliance commitments, to strengthen Philippines' force posture, to expand our EDCA sites. He was sort of willing to do anything that was in our mutual interest as long as we could talk it through and make a good case for it. So both of those two leaders really led to just an incredibly fruitful period in both of our alliances. I would say my big downside surprise did not come from a particular leader, but rather the alignment of two really unpleasant challengers. And that is the fact that nobody had on their bingo card the DPRK-Russia relationship becoming what it would become a little ways into President Biden's tenure. Based on where things had been previously, until you get Russia's war with Ukraine, it is hard to imagine a level of Russian desperation and need for material that causes it to turn to Pyongyang in the way that it did. But very quickly, that relationship cemented itself into something quite significant indeed, which was all the more frustrating because there were so few ways for even the most focused of policymakers to intervene in that relationship. And specifically, I mean the fact that arms transfers from the DPRK to Russia were flowing over rail lines or through territorial seas. Every good idea you can come up with as to how we, can try to thwart this cooperation is incredibly hard to achieve. Now, we can talk about all the sort of causes that brought them together, and that's the source of a much longer conversation. But if I could identify one big unpleasant surprise, it's DPRK Russia.
Which, complicates a lot of things. Peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, any function at all for the UN Security Council and constraining North Korea, the front in Ukraine where, North Korea's providing arms and people, all around a bad combination, but probably propelled the Euro-Atlantic consolidation on Asia. I mean, I banged my head against this when I was in the NSC 20 years ago. The Europeans were about to lift the arms embargo on China right as China was about to pass the anti-secession law legalizing, formally legalizing the use of force. And it was very hard to talk the Europeans out of it. We're in a much better place now, maybe as much thanks to China as American diplomacy, but this whole axis of thugs, and especially the Sino-Russian cooperation around Ukraine, it probably made it a lot easier to get Europe into the game and into Pacific on the side of balance of power and not just selling stuff to China, right? Did you feel a palpable change in dealing with Europeans on Asia?
I think we did. I will say that we started talking to our European friends about serious Asia issues very early on in the administration and well before Russia's invasion, including on very sensitive issues like Taiwan. And I will say that when that diplomacy was careful, focused, and specific, we found takers everywhere. There was a huge desire to improve knowledge, improve policy responses, think through ways to cooperate. And I think that is because we were still coming off that period in which the Chinese have been so aggressive and overplayed their hands during the COVID period. So there was a bit of a sense of pushing on an open door on some of these issues. But there is no question that Russia's invasion of Ukraine really caused some of our friends in Europe to want to double down on their relationships in the Indo-Pacific as well.
And it was in part also because the administration took Europe seriously. You can't expect European help on the other side of the world if you don't take Europe seriously, if you don't take NATO seriously. We'll come back to that in a minute. It is a problem right now. So Jake, I think it was after the Camp David summit, which was a big accomplishment for the administration, when the Japanese Prime Minister, the Korean President, and the U.S. President met at Camp David, and didn't completely reconcile the Japan-Korea issues, but created a space for a lot more cooperation on security and diplomacy. And I remember Jake, I think it was after that, Jake said in a press conference, we're not creating an Asian NATO. And then just to cause a little trouble, I did a piece in, I think it was Foreign Affairs, saying never say never to an Asian NATO. And the argument I was making is people thought the Quad was dead. Nobody would have predicted AUKUS with the US, Australia, UK. Nobody would have predicted the Squad, US, Japan, Australia, Philippines. All these things are happening because the security environment's changing and the challenges are growing. And because China is pressing on multiple fronts, it is linking these bilateral alliances, even NATO, together because it has a multi-front campaign for fill in the blank, hegemony, coercion, war planning, all of the above. And so the argument I was making is it's not a bad idea that China think their activities could create the very thing they don't want, which is a NATO. So fess up. Although Jake said we're not creating a NATO, that must have crossed your mind.
Well, Mike, I am a longtime scholar and deep lover of American alliances, and I would never say never to an Asian NATO if one were to come knocking. But I don't think that's what we were trying for in this particular instance, in no small part just because we're not there yet. And in particular, Asia's geography, Asia's threat profile doesn't at this moment necessitate things like a joint headquarters, an integrated military command across allies, achieving a NATO truly collective defense-like structure. We'd still have a very long way to go in the Indo-Pacific. The tack that this administration took, which Jake has also spoken about at length numerous times, was the idea of creating overlapping lattice works that were more fit for purpose and mission-driven as opposed to being about a fully integrated multilateral structure. And at least for our money and at this stage of the game, it is easier, more practical, perhaps more persuasive to be able to focus allies and partners on the challenges that they specifically care about and get them to mobilize resources in building that collective capacity to deal with those challenges rather than trying to get 6 or 8, however many you're including, allies agreeing to focus on one unified mission. Now, that could change. And the easiest way that would change would be if the PRC continues its aggressive behavior all around the region so that countries like India feel like they have an increasing stake in the Taiwan Straits and Korea feels like it has an increasing stake in the South China Sea. And that very well could happen. But for now, I think we see a number of Indo-Pacific allies and partners who still have slightly differentiated focuses when it comes to the sub-region and the nature of their greatest concern. And so by being very targeted in the way we built our partnerships, we were able to speak directly to those concerns in a way that could keep things moving forward. But again, with so many allies and partners that have such profound security concerns, you can never take anything off the table.
Totally agree. It would be counterproductive to push for collective security defense right now. It's counterproductive, frankly, for Prime Minister Ishida to propose an Asian NATO, but nobody knows what he means. So maybe it's not hurting anything. But I do think when you look at China's coercion, they have expanded their operations and regularized their military operations all around Taiwan, all around Japan, recently with significant exercises between Australia and New Zealand, which are now, I am sure, going to be regularized as well. You did a lot of work with us at CSIS on this maritime gray zone coercion. Cost imposition, every crisis is an opportunity, should involve putting in place the structures for, if not NATO, a federated defense or an interoperability or a common intelligence and operating picture every time they do it. Every time they do it. A, because it's cost imposition, and B, frankly, because this is not just a Chinese strategy for asserting territorial claims. This is a rehearsal for a theater-wide military campaign. And we need to be putting in place, every time they do it, the connections, the command and control, the exercises, the capabilities to be ready for that. I do think that's among our closest allies, well understood. Okay, a few things happening in Washington these days. Where to begin? Let me begin with this. I think you'd agree that Asia policy is probably the most bipartisan area of politics in Washington, and that for people who don't know it on the outside, people who worked in the Clinton, Obama, Biden NSC have a lot of time for people who worked in the Bush, Trump NSCs. The Asia experts in NSC, defense, state, are looking at the same problems and looking at the same solutions, allies. The big differences don't really come so much from how we look at Asia, but how the rest of the political ecosystem looks at the world. And of course, it's quite different now, that larger worldview. You and I know the people in the NSC going into State on Asia, and they're good. I have a lot of time for them. They are working in an environment where the administration's thinking very differently about a lot of things. Not sure there's a consensus on all of it. So as a way to get into that discussion briefly at the end, what aspects of building this lattice work, this network of alliances and partners, what aspect is most important to preserve for your successors in the NSC and the administration over the next few years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I totally agree with you, Mike. Asia is an area in which it's easy to be bipartisan. And I also think that our ultimate success, however we're choosing to define it, whether on this podcast or elsewhere, requires that bipartisan cooperation. We're talking about a challenge that's with us at least for the next few decades. So we have to be able to do reasonably smooth, consistent, and reliable handoffs, even if each president has the opportunity to put his or her mark on policy and strategy. The key ingredient is steady, consistent U.S. leadership, even if the nature of that is changing a little bit from administration to administration. So there's no secret sauce beneath that. That's pillar number one. But what I would say to my successors, who I wish the absolute best to and very much respect, is that the critical ingredients are exactly the top lines of what you just said, Mike. It's the allies and partners. And it's not just bringing allies and partners along, telling them what our approach is going to be and hoping that they'll fall in line. It's doing the oftentimes painful spade work day to day to actually align our policies and then move out together. It is much harder to work with a group of 6 or 8 close allies and partners than it is to work unilaterally. It is way, way harder, but we have no alternative. And so we have to commit ourselves to conducting that daily granular diplomacy, to getting the buy-in to our new national strategy, to making sure that every time we're going to do a big announcement, there's a huge round of consultations with all of those closest folks where we take their concerns on board and then we work to mitigate them over time, even if the policy is not entirely to their liking. I think the worst thing that we can do, and no administration is free of this sin, is to blindside allies and partners on an aspect of regional policy that they consider to be critical to their alliance with the United States or critical to their success in the region, because that's what makes them worry that steady U.S. leadership will not always be forthcoming. Now, within the sort of broad strokes advice that I just outlined, there's a huge amount of room for variation and improvisation. Obviously, as we've already discussed, the Quad is back at the foreign ministerial level. Secretary Rubio already convened it. That's wonderful. There's infinite space to put new Trump administration 2 branding on some of these alliances and partnerships that the Biden administration worked so hard to modernize and tend. No reason that any of this has to be specific to any one administration, and it can absolutely be rebranded. But one thing that we've already touched on, Mike, is the fact that Indo-Pacific policy is no longer just Asia policy. Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines, they all care not only about what's happening in the waterways of the Indo-Pacific, but what's happening on the battlefields in Europe. So we cannot convince ourselves that simply by saying that Indo-Pacific policy is bipartisan and we're seeking some amount of continuity, that we're actually going to achieve that continuity. Because alliance credibility transfers across regions. American reliability is a universal commodity. It does not know any geography. So keeping this system running and reasonably intact is going to require both of those things measured on a global level.
Yeah, I mean, traveling around the region and talking to senior officials and politicians in Taipei, Tokyo, Canberra, and so forth, the Ukraine situation and tariffs have really unnerved some of our closest friends, no doubt about it. That's not a secret. It is interesting, though. It's disheartening in some ways, but it's interesting because if you were to say, all right, what does Harris administration really needs to see from allies and partners? High on the list would be more defense spending and more collaboration with each other. And although it's not entirely for the right reasons, that's probably what we're going to see. The debate in Australia is heating up about going from 2 to 3% of GDP defense spending. Not politicians, they have an election. That doesn't win votes, but behind the scenes. In Taiwan, they're now having this discussion. I could tell you that Japan, Australia, Japan-Taiwan relationships are thickening because there's now uncertainty. There's always some level of uncertainty, but there's now heightened uncertainty about the U.S. on top of growing alarm at China. And none of our close allies are talking about de-aligning. Nobody is introducing no government is introducing a plan B where they de-align. They've got no option. So I say this intellectually, it doesn't warm my heart. I'm not sure I'm convincing myself completely, but there is a pattern emerging where allies are starting to do some things we always really wanted. Is the cost worth it? Was there another way to get that? What do you think?
Well, number one, I'd say it's early days. We're less than 8 weeks in. So let's not totally diagnose where we're going in our alignment patterns yet.
Fair enough.
Number two, I would say we've actually seen these trend lines of allies being willing to do more and spend more for quite a while. We certainly were very pleased inside of the Indo-Pacific of what those trend lines looked like during the Biden administration, where, of course, Japan committed to spending 2% of defense on GDP. Australia initially did a defense bump. South Korea certainly did. This is not necessarily a new thing. What is new and what you're describing is allies thinking through more intentionally how they will cooperate with one another in a way that will reinforce their own resilience, even at a time when the United States might be less predictable. Now, you and I have a mutual friend and colleague, Zach Cooper, who's written a bit about this, and I think has wisely said a number of times that when allies are kind of striking out on their own, what you want them to do is spend in ways that reinforce capabilities that continue to allow for mutual defense. So the risk would be that if you have a Japan or an ROK investing in indigenous or other regional capabilities that don't come from the United States, 4 years from now, are you less interoperable? Are you less able to show up to the big event together and actually prevail? That's a serious question. So I think a priori, allies spending more on their own, could be a good thing headed in the right direction, or it could represent a problematic trend over time that could reduce our interoperability. But on the positive side of the ledger, Mike, I think you're pointing here in broader strokes to something that we thought about a lot during the Biden administration. We, of course, did not in any way wish or anticipate that the United States would become less predictable again. But we came into office on the heels of the first Trump administration. And we knew that we were constantly going to have to prove to allies and partners that we were really back this time. So part of our intention in building this system of overlapping lattice works was to help accelerate the ties between countries like Japan, Australia, ROK, India, all of our incredibly capable and close partners, so that no matter what happened down the line, they would have stronger networks together and frameworks within that they were operating, which they could use to continue to pull the balance of power in their direction, no matter where exactly we were. And I do think that we are seeing a little bit of that now. I strongly hope that they'll keep it up. I think we've got some incredible regional leaders in our allies and partners out there who are capable of doing so. But we're likely to see trend lines in terms of defense investments, just to identify one bucket, that are going to look very different than they have in the past going forward.
It's a really good point Zach makes. Our allies, I did my dissertation on this, our allies are always, and we are always going to, lean into building our own defense industrial base, our own technologies, our own competitiveness. So these procurement and capability building strategies are never just about optimizing deterrence. There's always an industrial policy, that's for sure. But I have not seen yet in Japan or Australia or Korea or Taiwan a move away from doubling down on the U.S. as a source of strategic intelligence, technology, joint development. There are debates about AUKUS in the press, but the government's not seeing anything coming out of Washington that would change the progress we've made and so on and so forth. So we haven't seen that yet. But if we did start to see hedging behavior where capabilities were purely unilateral, then we would have a huge problem. But haven't seen it yet. Last question for you. The other side gets a vote. So if you were playing China in this game right now, you would absolutely be pursuing wedge strategies. And it's pretty obvious to me that's happening in the global south. It's happening with Europe. It's especially happening in Southeast Asia as the U.S. pulls back right now suddenly on development and civil society and other forms of engagement. The Chinese Foreign Ministry and others are coming in trying to fill that gap at American expense. But at the same time, the PLA is absolutely doubling down on highly visible threatening military exercises right in Australia and New Zealand's backyard, all the way around Japan, all the way around Taiwan, against the Philippines. So if they have a wedge strategy, it's not a fairly sophisticated one. What's your take on the Chinese counter strategy to everything you were doing and that we're seeing right now?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There's no question that wedge strategy in general is the dominant strategy. And I will just note, you alluded to this, Mike, it's really hard for the United States, nay, impossible, to be competitive in the region if we're not using foreign assistance as a key part of our toolkit. If you had asked me for one thing I needed more of in my job, it was the ability to bring online relatively small dollar, quick turnaround projects so that we could show partners like our friends in the Pacific Islands that we are able to help them do things like build a new hospital or build a new road. When the PRC shows up with a check in hand, offering to do the same with far more problematic entanglements and attachments, and we're not able to compete. Drawing down foreign assistance dollars will really hurt us in the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia, and that, of course, is the ballgame. But to your question, Mike, about China's wedge strategy, I think you're right that the developing world is where the target is for now. I think, frankly, they're waiting to see a little bit where things are going to shake out in the bilateral relationship, because the tariff focus, while it certainly has hit China, has also been so overwhelmingly on Canada and Mexico that they don't really have the contours at the ready yet to know what the bilateral relationship is going to look like. But my guess would be there will be some point in the coming months where the pressure eases off a little bit. And after all of these really threatening, intimidating exercises, the Chinese are essentially asking our closest partners in the region, who looks more like the adult in this moment now? Is it us, or is it those other guys across the pond who are doing unpredictable things? Now, we know that the Chinese are perfectly capable of overplaying their hand, so maybe they won't ease off the exercises. We can never be too sure about that. But I would be surprised if they did not find a way to take advantage of this moment and to try to convince even our closest friends that there was some form of light rapprochement to be had in an effort to retake some of this balance of power that we feel we were successfully able to shift back in our direction.
Power abhors a vacuum, and China loves power, so we're not helping ourselves, that's for sure. Mira, it's been really interesting. I know you're kind of recharging your batteries right now, and you'll be out in public again, writing and doing things, and really looking forward to it. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Always great to talk to you, and thanks for having me back on the podcast.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.